German government crisis. What damage has been done? In the interview, Left Party parliamentary leader Gregor Gysi.
Mr. Gysi, the blunders made by Chancellor Merkel's grand coalition, the Adati affair, relating to the possession of pictures of naked children, gave the opposition a clear opportunity. Yet there's a feeling you didn't capitalize. Is that deceptive?
Yes, it is. The problem is that politicians already have a bad reputation. This situation will make our reputation even worse, and we'll all be affected, whether we're part of the government or the opposition. Of course, the situation is quite serious, involving betrayal, denunciation and mistrust. First of all, the accused was tipped off, an advantage that was not justified. But now he has to deal with extremely negative media coverage, which is also not right. The rule of law and the presumption of innocence still apply. I don't understand why Hans-Peter Friedrich informed the SPD leadership and not the Chancellor. I would have given the Chancellor the information I had so she could make a decision. The Chancellor could have waited until Sigmar Gabriel put forward Sebastian Edati for the position of Interior Minister and then said no. If he asked why, she could have said that he would find out in a few days, and that's it. Then there would have been no betrayal, no denunciation, nothing. And it all went wrong in every way.
But why haven't you demanded the resignation of the SPD parliamentary leader Thomas Oppermann? His behavior has been questionable throughout.
I've never demanded anyone's resignation. I demand consequences to keep it from happening again. The SPD has to make its own decisions. For me, the key issue is stopping things like this from happening in the future.
What's happening there?
It annoys me that the three-party leaders, Angela Merkel, Horst Seehofer and Sigmar Gabriel, are all talking, but they're not telling us what they've agreed to. The German people have a right to transparency and information. I find it incredible that when the SPD says it won't sacrifice Oppermann as the CSU demanded, the CSU says in that case you have to let us introduce road tolls. So politics degenerates completely. It's like we're in a bazaar or something. It really agitates me, and therefore we'll keep putting pressure on. But overall, I have to say this whole situation has damaged the image of politics. They have to realize that, and we're holding that against them.
You just mentioned the damage caused. Politicians have confused the welfare of their party and the state. Can't politicians separate the two?
Not always, especially with legal obligations. I mean, Friedrich said the law was wrong, but it's not that simple. When someone's being tried in court, they can't just say it's the law that's at fault. That way you'll never get anywhere. But what really annoys me is this half-hearted response, and that's all to do with the Grand Coalition. They're too powerful, and they know they won't lose that power regardless of what they do here.
Are things calming down?
Yes, the mutual trust between them has been dented. You can't forget that. If the level of trust in the government isn't right, there will be consequences on parliamentary work and other things. But with the European elections, for example, they don't seem interested. They're raising their expenses and just voting everything through. That's all to do with power. When you have almost absolute power, abuse is never far away.
Let's go back to Adati. He was considered an honorable politician and headed the commission investigating the terrorist NSU.
And he did good work.
As everyone says. But does Adati's behavior discredit the NSU Commission's work?
Perhaps not the Commission, because they've published their findings. Their findings have been established, and there was a unanimous resolution in Parliament, which is very rare. But he should have asked himself that question at the time. Even if he's allowed to do what he's accused of doing, it's morally reprehensible. I understand the stance of Heiko Maas, who's looking at a new law on this issue. But we have to be careful. Pictures of naked children have to be allowed in medicine, in science as well. You can't ban them in art and culture either. But rather just the commercial traffic. You can't ask a 3- or 4-year-old if they consent. And it's a worldwide issue. If you become famous, people around the world can easily obtain pictures of you naked as a child. So I'm prepared to consider the consequences.
Bin da auch bereit, darüber nachzudenken, dass man da Konsequenzen ziehen muss.
Themenwechsel.
Let's change topics. It looks like the tension could be easing in Ukraine after a rapprochement between the opposition and President Viktor Yanukovych's government. Yanukovych still seems to be clinging to power. It seems a bit like the end of East Germany. What's your advice for Yanukovych?
Ich glaube, der wird gar nicht mit mir reden.
I don't think he wants to talk to me, but I'd like to start out differently. Both Russia and the EU made mistakes. Russia wanted closer ties with Ukraine, and the EU wanted the same thing. I think EU politicians didn't look closely enough at Ukraine's full story. For example, how Ukraine lies in the cradle of Russia, how part of the population predominantly speaks Russian, and the other part is more oriented towards Western Europe. Ukrainian society is divided in this way. If that had been acknowledged straight away, they could have got on the right track from the start and said Ukraine is a bridge between the EU and Russia. That's the only way you can get a geostrategic agreement. Secondly, I think now that the EU is taking action, Russia isn't doing enough. I suggested Gerhard Schröder speak to Vladimir Putin on behalf of the EU, because the two have a relationship based on trust. Schröder might convince him to change things. I hope that happens. Then there's society itself. There were electoral observers when the presidential elections were held. That's a big difference from East Germany. They never had that. The Ukrainian president clearly didn't reckon with this resistance, and then he reacted disproportionately. But of course the opposition is not unified. There are democratic groups, which we value, and then there are semi-democratic groups and right-wing extremist groups, who no one wants anything to do with. Their only common ground is that they're against the president. Otherwise, there's no agreement on what should happen in Ukraine. That's where the deeper problem lies, if it falls into a civil war like in Syria. Although no one wants that, that's what can happen in a divided country. The EU surely can't want that. So I say we need diplomacy, diplomacy and resolution. We need to keep demanding an end to the violence, to talk to both the president and the demonstrators. After all, some of them are violent too. And we have to find a solution. That's always difficult. The opposing sides need to consider each other's interests. I'll explain it like a lawyer. I know my client's interests, but if I don't know the interests of my opponent, I can't find compromise. If I understand their real interests, not just their demands, I can suggest concessions. They can make counter-offers, and then you come to an agreement. So I hope that happens and that it works. We want to avoid a civil war in Ukraine and Europe at all costs.
In the aftermath of the Cold War, are we experiencing a battle over spheres of influence between East and West?
Yes, of course. The problem is that the EU and the German government initially underestimated Russia's importance. That's also to do with how Boris Yeltsin emerged, with the terrible, totally amateurish war in Chechnya and so on. Then Vladimir Putin came and organized and structured the country completely differently when he marched into Georgia. I think he wanted to prove to the West that he could do it, and within 48 hours if he wants to. Most didn't pick up on that and are only now realizing that they have to take Russia seriously because of Syria. The USA said there could only be an agreement on Syria that included Russia. Putin wanted that too, but the EU was reluctant to accept it. We have to do two things with Russia. We have to accept their power and importance and their history, and we have to accept a man like Putin. Secondly, we can't stop calling for the rule of law and more democracy. We have to keep bringing that up, with actions too. But we have to do that worldwide. Our relationship with human rights disturbs me. We look away when it comes to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia even gets weapons from us. I think that's wrong. I tell members of my party that they tend to look closer in one place than in others. That's not right either. Human rights have to apply always and everywhere.
Menschenrechte müssen immer und überall gelten.
There's a catchphrase at the moment. European elections. You've already had your party conference. Beforehand, there was discord over what your party should do regarding the EU and Europe. But that was all swept under the rug. Is that because you can't make any gains if you say anything against Europe?
You're asking me about my party. That's always the hardest part. I prefer talking about other things. But the party conference was a success. We achieved two things that are important in my view. Firstly, we made it clear that we're pro-European and in favour of European integration and the EU. On the other hand, we're very critical of EU policy when it comes to dismantling social welfare and democracy, and regarding military action. That was all expressed. That means we can say to people that we're not against Europe, but we do want a different Europe. A Europe where young people say yes to Europe. If I ask a young person in Greece, one of the 60% who are unemployed, what do you think he or she would say about Europe? I can imagine. I don't need to ask. We have to make sure that people see Europe in terms of social welfare, as a place of democracy, a place of more culture. Then we have to take a few cultural steps, perhaps with the help of Deutsche Welle. What I want in Europe, including Russia, is that all children,
we're out of time,
that all children learn the same foreign language, a generation of young people who all speak one language.
Thank you, Mr. Gysi.